My name is Margaret Sullivan, and I'm going to tell you something I've never spoken about publicly before. For the past 7 years, I've kept this story locked inside my chest, afraid of judgment, afraid of questions, afraid of admitting that the man I married wasn't who I thought he was. But I'm done with silence. I'm done with protecting his image. This is my truth, and it starts on a Tuesday evening in March, in our apartment overlooking downtown Boston. I remember the exact moment he walked through the door that day. Michael had his leather briefcase in one hand and that familiar smile on his face, the one that used to make my heart skip when we were dating. I was in the kitchen preparing dinner, pasta primavera, his favorite. The late afternoon sun was streaming through the windows, catching the dust particles in the air, and I felt that flutter of anticipation that a wife gets when she knows her husband has had a big day at work. He'd been interviewing for the senior vice president position at his firm for weeks. Weeks of late dinners, of stress, of him coming home exhausted and disappearing into his office for hours. "I got it," he said, before even closing the door behind him. Those 3 words, "I got it." They seemed so simple, so celebratory. I dropped the wooden spoon I was holding and ran to him, wrapping my arms around his neck. He hugged me back, but I noticed something different in the embrace. It wasn't warm. It was perfunctory, like he was checking off a box. But I pushed that feeling aside because I was so happy for him. We'd talked about this promotion for months. He'd worked so hard, sacrificed so much time with me, with our relationship, but it was going to be worth it. That's what he'd always said. Once he got promoted, things would settle down. He'd have more flexibility, more confidence, more peace. I was so naive. That first week was actually wonderful. Michael seemed energized, almost euphoric. He took me to dinner at this upscale Italian restaurant in the Back Bay neighborhood. He bought me flowers. He held my hand across the table and told me he loved me. I remember thinking that maybe this was the beginning of a new chapter for us. Maybe all the stress and distance we'd been experiencing was just the pressure of wanting something so badly. Now that he had it, everything would return to normal. We'd return to normal. I was 34 years old, and I was still believing in fairy tales. The shift happened gradually, not all at once. That's what makes it so insidious. It's not like one day he became a different person. It was more like watching a photograph slowly fade in sunlight. You don't notice it changing day by day, but one morning you realize the colors are no longer vibrant. The image is no longer sharp. The first small thing was his schedule. The promotion came with longer hours, which I understood. Corporate work is demanding, but it wasn't just the hours. It was how he started treating those hours like they were sacred, like nothing else in my world could possibly be as important as his job. If I mentioned plans, even something simple like dinner with a friend on Friday night, he would give me this look. Not angry, disappointed. Like I was being selfish for suggesting that anything could take priority over being available for him. "Maggie," he'd say, and I hated when he called me that, even though he knew I did. "I need you to understand that this position requires a certain level of commitment. I need to know that my home is my sanctuary, that you're there when I need you." Is that too much to ask? Of course, I felt guilty. What kind of wife wouldn't support her husband during such an important time? So I canceled plans. First it was monthly, then it was every invitation. My best friend, Claire, stopped calling eventually. She probably got tired of me saying no. Then there was the money. This was the part that confused me the most because on the surface, having more money should have made things better. But it didn't. Michael started controlling where every dollar went. Before the promotion, we had separate bank accounts and contributed to shared expenses proportionally. It was fair, balanced, adult. But after the promotion, he insisted on consolidating everything into a single account that he managed. "It's more efficient," he said. "And honestly, Maggie, you're not great with finances. You're too emotional about money. You spend without thinking about the future. I need to make sure we're secure." I wanted to argue. Part of me knew this wasn't right, but he presented it so logically, so reasonably. And there was this undertone, just barely perceptible, that suggested I was being irresponsible, that I needed his guidance. So I agreed. I gave him access to my salary, my inheritance from my grandmother, everything. In exchange, he gave me a monthly allowance. $800. That was supposed to cover all my personal expenses, my clothes, my hygiene products, my phone bill, everything. When I questioned the amount, he reminded me that he was the primary earner now. His promotion had increased our household income substantially. It was only fair that the money be allocated to priorities. His priorities, his career, his needs. You can ask me if you need something, he said. I'm not unreasonable, Maggie. I just need to be responsible about our future. But when I did ask, there were questions. Questions that felt like accusations. Why did I need new shoes? Weren't the ones I had still functional? Why was I spending money on a massage? That was an indulgence, a luxury he couldn't afford to support, given his stress levels at work. I found myself becoming very small, smaller and smaller, like I was literally shrinking as a person. I stopped buying things I needed. I wore clothes with holes in them because asking for new ones felt too confrontational. I made excuses to my friends about why I couldn't go out. I told them I was tired, busy, working on projects at home. None of it was true. I was just disappearing. The psychological component of this, and I understand now after years of therapy that this is what it was. The psychological component was that Michael never said anything overtly cruel. He never called me names. He never raised his voice, not really. He was always calm, always rational, always presenting himself as the reasonable one who was just trying to take care of things while I was being hysterical or emotional or unrealistic. This type of control, this type of manipulation, it's so much harder to identify than physical violence. It's insidious because you start questioning your own mind. I remember one evening, I was reading a book on the couch while he worked in his office. I'd finished a chapter and laughed out loud at something funny. Michael came out of his office and asked what was funny. I told him, and he just shook his head. Maggie, that's not funny. That's actually kind of sad. Why are you laughing at something so depressing? And suddenly I didn't know. I sat there holding this book, and I couldn't remember why I'd found it funny. I questioned myself. Did I have bad taste? Was I being stupid? What had I been thinking? This happened over and over. Small corrections. Small suggestions that my perspective was off. My judgment was questionable. My instincts were wrong. He never said I was stupid. He never said I was crazy. But I started to feel that way. I started to doubt every thought in my head. My parents called one Sunday afternoon. They wanted to invite us to their anniversary party in Providence. It was a big celebration, and they were flying in relatives from California. I was excited and nervous because Michael hadn't been particularly warm toward my family in the past few years. They'd noticed the distance too. But I told them we'd love to come. When I told Michael about the party, his reaction was immediate and cold. I don't have time for this, Maggie. I have 3 major presentations scheduled for April. I need that weekend to prepare. You know how important this is to my career. It's my parents' anniversary, I said quietly, and I'm working to pay for everything we have. The apartment, the car, your health insurance. Don't I get a say in how my time is spent? I didn't go. I called my mother and told her I had a stomach bug. I could hear the disappointment in her voice, even though she tried to hide it. She never said it, but I knew she understood. She'd seen this happening to me. She tried to talk to me about it a few times, and I defended Michael fiercely. I told her she didn't understand how demanding his job was. I told her she was being judgmental. I was angry with her for not supporting my marriage, when really, she was trying to support me. By the end of that first year after his promotion, I was completely isolated. I didn't have regular contact with my friends. I'd stopped going to the yoga classes I loved. I'd left my book club. I'd become a character in my own life, and I was playing the role of the dutiful wife who existed to support her husband's ambitions. The apartment we lived in became smaller and smaller, even though it was objectively a large space. I spent most of my time in the kitchen or the bedroom. I'd stay up late waiting for him to come home, then wake up early to make him breakfast. My entire day was structured around his needs and his schedule. When he was in a good mood, I felt lighter. When he seemed stressed, I felt this anxiety in my chest, this sense of responsibility to fix it, to make things better for him. And the worst part, the thing that makes me angry even now talking about it, is that I genuinely believed I was being a good wife. I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought that this was what marriage was, that you sacrificed, that you made yourself smaller so that your partner could be bigger. That love meant losing yourself in someone else. It took me a long time to understand that this was not love. This was a prison, and I was both the guard and the prisoner. The second year of Michael's promotion is when things escalated in ways that were harder for me to rationalize. I was 35 years old, and I realized I couldn't remember the last time I'd felt happy. Not just content or managing, actually happy. That realization came to me on a Tuesday morning when I was making his breakfast, and I caught my reflection in the polished steel of the refrigerator. I barely recognized myself. I was gaunt. There were dark circles under my eyes. My hair had turned prematurely gray at the temples, and I just hadn't bothered to dye it because it felt like too much effort. Too indulgent. The control, which had started with the finances and his time, began expanding into every aspect of my life. He started commenting on my appearance. Not in an obvious way. It was never, "You look terrible." It was more subtle than that. "That dress makes you look heavier than you are," he'd say. Not that you're heavy. You're not. But that particular style isn't flattering. You might want to consider wearing something else. Or, "Your makeup looks a bit harsh today. Are you okay? You seem stressed." I'd go back to the bedroom and change. I'd wash off the makeup and reapply it, trying to figure out what was wrong with how I'd done it the first time. I started asking him what I should wear before getting dressed. I'd open my closet and feel paralyzed by the choices, because I was so afraid of making the wrong decision. This is what gaslighting does. It makes you question your own perception of reality. It makes you dependent on someone else's approval, because you've lost faith in your own judgment. The isolation deepened. He started making comments about my friends. Claire, my best friend since college, had reached out again. She was getting married and wanted me to be in the wedding. I was thrilled and terrified in equal measure. "I don't think you should be in the wedding party," Michael said when I mentioned it. "It's too much of a time commitment. And frankly, Claire has always been a bad influence on you. She's selfish, and she doesn't really care about your marriage. She just wants you to go out drinking and act irresponsibly." None of that was true. Claire had never pressured me to do anything. She'd been patient with me for years as I disappeared from her life. But by this point, I had so little confidence in my own perception of reality that I actually started to believe Michael. Maybe Claire had been a bad influence. Maybe I was better off without that friendship. I called Claire and told her I couldn't be in the wedding. I lied and said I had a prior commitment. She was quiet on the phone for a long moment, and then she said something that cut through the fog I'd been living in. "Maggie, I'm worried about you. This isn't the first time you've canceled on me. This isn't the first time you've chosen Michael over our friendship. I love you, but I can't keep doing this. I can't keep reaching out only to be rejected. I'm going to step back, and I hope you'll figure out what's happening here." After I hung up the phone, I sat in the kitchen for a very long time. I felt something crack open inside my chest. Not a big, dramatic crack, just a small fissure. But through that fissure came a whisper of a thought. What is happening here? Is any of this normal? Michael came home that evening and found me sitting in the dark living room. He turned on the lights and asked me what was wrong. "Claire called," I said. "She seemed hurt that I'm not being in her wedding." He sat down beside me, and his voice was so reasonable, so calm. "Of course she's hurt, Maggie. She wanted to use you for her wedding. Now that you've set a boundary, she's upset. That's not your fault. That's her being manipulative. You did the right thing." And just like that, the crack I'd felt opening sealed itself back up. He made sense. He always made sense. I accepted his interpretation of events so easily because the alternative, that he was manipulating me, that he was isolating me, that he was wrong, felt too overwhelming, too destabilizing. But I started keeping a journal. I didn't consciously decide to do it. It just started happening. I'd be in the kitchen, waiting for him to come home, and I'd have this overwhelming need to write down what was happening. What he'd said, what I'd felt. I found an old notebook in a drawer, and I started recording incidents in a shorthand that I thought only I would understand. 10:15. Asked about going to book club. M said no. Said book club was waste of time. I'm not intelligent enough to contribute to real discussion. Made me cry. Then apologized and said he was just being honest because he loves me. 11:30. M asked about money I spent on groceries. Said $127 was too much. I need to learn to budget better. Took away my access to credit card. Now have to ask for cash. 12/1. Haven't seen parents in 8 months. M says they're toxic. Says they're trying to turn me against him. Is he right? I can't remember anymore why I'm so distant from them. I hid the journal behind the books on the bookshelf in the bedroom. I told myself it was just for me, just to get things out of my head. But subconsciously, I think I knew what I was doing. I was creating a record. I was documenting the slow erasure of myself. And I was doing it because some small part of me, the part that hadn't completely disappeared, knew that I would need this evidence someday. That I would need to remember that I wasn't crazy, that things really were as wrong as they felt. The incidents escalated that winter. There was the night he came home in a foul mood because of something that had happened at work. A colleague had questioned one of his decisions in a meeting. He was furious, and he came home seething with this barely contained rage. I could feel it radiating off him as soon as he walked in the door. I'd learned to be very careful on nights like this. I'd learned to be small, quiet, agreeable. I made him dinner. I gave him space. I waited for him to tell me what was wrong so I could be the right person, say the right things, do the right things. But nothing I did was right. He snapped at me for how I'd cooked the steak. He complained that the apartment was cold. He said my presence was making him more anxious, that he needed me to leave him alone. So I went to the bedroom. I sat on the bed and tried to read, but I was listening for him, listening for any indication of what he needed. After an hour, he came into the bedroom. His mood had shifted. He was no longer angry. He was almost affectionate. He came over to me and he kissed me. And then, for the first time, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. I felt afraid. Not afraid that he would hit me. Nothing like that happened. But afraid of something else. Afraid of the sudden shift. Afraid of not knowing what mood he'd be in. Afraid of not knowing what would set him off. Afraid of being responsible for managing his emotions. He wanted to be intimate that night, and I let him. Because refusing would have made things worse. Because I'd learned that my body wasn't mine to refuse. It was part of the agreement. I was his wife. I was supposed to be available to him. That's what he'd said, and I believed him. The next morning, I felt something break inside me. Not just crack. Break. Like something that could never be put back together the same way. I called a therapist. I didn't tell Michael. I found a woman therapist who had openings in the morning, and I started seeing her once a week. I told Michael I was going for early morning walks because I was concerned about my fitness. He approved of this. He thought it was good that I was trying to take care of myself, even though I wasn't naturally athletic and I probably wouldn't stick with it. Dr. Patricia Coleman was in her 60s, gray hair, kind eyes, and she had a way of asking questions that made me feel heard without being judged. In our first session, I couldn't stop talking. I just poured everything out. The financial control, the isolation, the constant criticism, the way he manipulated my perception of reality, the way he made me feel crazy. And she listened. And when I was done, she asked me one question. Margaret, what would you call what you just described? I sat with that question for a long moment because I didn't have a word for it. Michael wasn't physically abusive. He didn't yell. He was never overtly cruel. So what was it? Emotional abuse, Dr. Coleman said quietly. What you're describing is emotional abuse. Specifically, it sounds like coercive control combined with gaslighting and financial abuse. These are recognized patterns of intimate partner abuse. The word abuse landed on me like a physical weight. I wanted to argue. I wanted to tell her that she didn't understand, that Michael loved me, that this was just how he was. But something in me recognized the truth of what she was saying. And I started to cry. For the next several months, I worked with Dr. Coleman to understand what had happened to me, to understand how I'd become so small, to understand that none of this was my fault. that I wasn't crazy, that my instincts had been right all along. Something was deeply wrong. She helped me understand the pattern. The pattern is always the same with coercive control. First comes the idealization phase, where everything is perfect and you feel truly seen by this person. Then comes the devaluation phase, where the criticisms start, the isolation starts, the small eroding of your sense of self. Then comes the crisis, the explosion, the dramatic moment where you finally see clearly what's happening. And then comes the reconciliation, where they apologize or they reframe what happened, or they make you feel like you're the one who misunderstood. And then the cycle begins again. I was caught in a cycle, a predictable, repeating cycle that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with power and control. Michael didn't know I was in therapy, or if he did, he never acknowledged it. He was traveling more for work, and in some ways, this was a relief. His absence gave me space to think, space to start putting the pieces together, space to start making a plan, though I wasn't entirely sure what that plan was yet. I remember one afternoon coming home from therapy and finding Michael's laptop on the kitchen counter. He'd left it open, and a notification popped up while I was standing there. It was an email from his work account, but the content made my blood run cold. It was a message to a colleague. Once I get Maggie completely dependent on me, financially and psychologically, I'll have complete control over the situation. She'll never leave me, and even if she tried, she has nothing. No money, no independence, nowhere to go. I've already cut off her family. Next step is completely eliminating her friends. I stood there for what felt like hours, even though it was probably only minutes. I read that email over and over again. I wanted to believe it wasn't real. I wanted to believe that I'd misunderstood something, but I hadn't. This was proof, concrete proof that what was happening was intentional, that this wasn't just how he was. This was who he was. He was calculating. He was strategic. He was deliberately destroying me, and he was doing it with full awareness of what he was doing. I quietly closed the laptop. I walked into the bedroom, and I pulled out my journal from behind the books. I added a new entry. February 18th. Found email on M's laptop. He is doing this on purpose. This is not an accident. This is not a misunderstanding. This is abuse, and it is intentional. I need to get out. But how? I have no money. I have no job. I have no independence. I have nothing. But I have to find a way. That night, I couldn't sleep. I laid in bed next to Michael, and I felt something shift inside me. It wasn't fear anymore. It was anger. Real, pure, focused anger. And I knew that anger was going to save my life. But I didn't. I just agreed. I was also working on rebuilding my employment history. Maria helped me understand that I would need to be able to support myself. I couldn't rely on alimony forever, and Elizabeth had warned me that Michael would probably fight tooth and nail on any settlement agreement that gave me a significant portion of the marital assets. The problem was that I hadn't worked in 2 years. Michael had convinced me that being a housewife was my job now, that I should focus on making the home a sanctuary for him, that my place was in the home. And like so much of what he told me, I'd believed it. So I'd given up my job as a marketing coordinator at a local nonprofit. It hadn't been glamorous, but I'd loved it. I'd loved the work. I'd loved my colleagues. And I'd given it all up for him. I couldn't magically get those 2 years back, but I could start moving forward. With Maria's help, I started reaching out to former colleagues. I connected with a woman named Jasmine who I'd worked with, and I was honest with her. I told her I was going through a difficult time and that I was interested in getting back into work. She didn't ask for details, but I could tell she suspected something was wrong. She offered to introduce me to someone at her new company. They weren't hiring yet, but they might be in a few months. I'll keep you in mind, she told me. Are you okay, Margaret? You seem different. I'm working on it, I said. And yeah, I will be okay. I'm going to be okay. Meanwhile, I was collecting evidence of Michael's abuse in other ways. I started photographing bank statements. I gathered insurance documents and investment statements. I documented the credit card accounts that were in his name only. I pulled our tax returns from the previous 2 years, which showed my income had been eliminated and all household income was now listed as Michael's. In May, Maria introduced me to a domestic violence shelter director named Susan. We met privately away from Michael. Susan helped me understand that there were resources available to me: emergency housing if I needed it, legal aid, counseling, job training. She also explained the concept of a safety plan. You need to think about what would happen if he became violent, Susan said carefully. Not to scare you, but to prepare you. Do you have places you could go quickly? Do you have people you can call? Do you have important documents in a place you can access quickly? I started gathering my important documents: my social security card, my birth certificate, my passport. I bought a small lockbox and hid it in the car. I created a folder on my computer with important information: my Gmail password, my bank account information, my therapist's contact information. I also started thinking about what I would take when I left. Not much. Not clothes or furniture, or any of the things we'd accumulated together. Just the things that mattered. My grandmother's jewelry, my books, my grandmother's quilt. I started discreetly packing a small suitcase with essentials. I kept it hidden in the back of my car, under a blanket. By June, I had almost $3,000 in my secret account. I had documented dozens of incidents of abuse. I had rebuilt my relationship with my mother and father. I had reconnected with Claire, who responded with so much grace and love that I cried when I saw her. She didn't ask many questions, but she held my hand and told me she was there for me, whatever I needed. The timeline was becoming clear. By July or August, I would have enough money. I would have enough evidence. I would be ready, and then I would leave. But I wasn't prepared for what happened in July. Michael came home one evening with plane tickets. He'd decided we were going to take a vacation to Cabo for an entire week. In August, when I had carefully planned to have enough money saved by September. I need a break, he said. The work has been incredibly demanding. We need to reconnect as a couple. I've planned everything. We're staying at a resort with private beach access. It's going to be amazing. My first instinct was pure panic. A week away would put my timeline back significantly. But then I realized something else. If I was away from the office that week, he would be too. And while we were away, I could do something I'd been too afraid to do before. I could access his email account. Michael used the same password for everything. I discovered this months ago when I needed to check something on his work email, and he'd carelessly left it open. The password was his mother's birth year, followed by an exclamation point and the word king. It was such a Michael password, authoritative, commanding, something he probably thought was clever, but was actually incredibly obvious. I'd written it down in my journal, hiding it in code that only I could understand. And I'd been tempted to use it so many times, but I'd also been afraid. Using his accounts without permission would be a violation. And if he found out, it would be a reason for him to punish me. It would be a reason to restrict me further. But I was past being afraid of that now. I was at the point where I had nothing left to lose. We arrived in Cabo on a Friday evening. The resort was beautiful, oceanfront, luxury, the kind of place Michael would choose because it was expensive and exclusive. We had a suite with a private balcony overlooking the Pacific. He'd arranged for a couple's massage, dinner reservations at an upscale restaurant, all the trappings of a romantic getaway. He was being particularly charming that week. He was touching me, complimenting me, telling me how much he loved me. It was the honeymoon phase of the cycle, that brief period where everything seemed perfect again. Part of me wanted to believe it. Part of me wanted to think that maybe I'd been wrong. Maybe things weren't as bad as I thought. Maybe he really did love me. But I knew better now. On the third night of our vacation, Michael had too much to drink at dinner. He fell asleep early. I sat out on the balcony, listening to the ocean, and I made a decision. I went back inside, and I took his laptop from the desk. I opened it. The screen came to life. I navigated to his email account and entered the password. It worked. I was in. What I found in the next 2 hours absolutely destroyed me and also absolutely confirmed everything I knew. There were emails to his boss. Emails describing me in terms that were degrading and dehumanizing. He'd written things like, "The wife is becoming increasingly cooperative. She no longer argues, which makes management much easier." There were emails to a colleague where he bragged about how much money he'd transferred to his private account, an account I didn't know existed, an account with over $180,000 in it. There were emails that made it clear he was having an affair. Multiple affairs, actually, with women he knew from work, with women he met through dating apps. And in every single one of these emails, he presented himself as single. He talked about his controlling ex-wife, me, who was jealous and unstable and had tried to trap him with a fake marriage. I felt like I was going to throw up. I made it to the bathroom just in time, and I was sick into the toilet. My whole body was shaking, but I kept going. I kept reading, because I needed to see it all. I needed to know the full extent of his lies. There were notes and drafts of emails he'd written to himself. In one, he was outlining a strategy for divorcing me while keeping the maximum amount of money. He'd written, "She has no job history, no income, limited education. I can argue that she's not capable of managing a settlement. I can paint her as mentally unstable. I have the emails where she was seeing a therapist. I can spin that as proof of psychological problems. If I can make the judge see her as unfit and unstable, I can minimize what she gets. The goal is that she walks away with nothing." I was sitting on the bathroom floor, reading this, and something inside me crystallized. This was my confirmation. This was my proof. This was the absolute bottom. And I was not going to let him do this to me. I photographed every email on my phone. I took screenshots. I documented everything. And then I closed his laptop and put it back exactly where I'd found it. Michael woke up the next morning with a hangover. He was grumpy and distant, a complete reversal from how he'd been treating me. I was quiet and compliant, exactly as he expected. But inside, I was making calculations. I had a plan now, a real plan, not just an abstract concept of leaving, but a concrete, actionable plan. I went to the bathroom and called Elizabeth, my attorney. I left her a voicemail explaining that I had new evidence and that I was ready to move forward. I asked her to begin preparing the divorce papers. For the rest of that week in Cabo, I played the part. I was the dutiful wife. I was available and pleasant and unthreatening. And I was gathering every piece of evidence I could find. On the flight home, I copied down the flight itineraries Michael had been looking at, trips he'd been planning with some of these women. I memorized the names of the hotels he'd mentioned. I documented everything. When we got back to Boston, I called Elizabeth and we had a long meeting in her office. "This is significant," she said, looking through the screenshots of the emails I'd printed out. "This shows premeditation, deliberate abuse, infidelity, and hidden assets. This completely changes the trajectory of your case. We can argue not only for a settlement that acknowledges the financial abuse, but also for punitive damages. The judge will likely look very unfavorably on his behavior. So I can leave?" I asked. "I can actually do this?" "You can absolutely do this," Elizabeth said. "And I think the time is now. The longer you wait, the more risk there is that he discovers what we're planning. Are you ready?" Was I ready? I thought about everything I'd endured. The constant criticism, the isolation, the loss of myself, the fear, the manipulation. I thought about that email where he'd written about deliberately destroying me. I thought about the affairs, the hidden money, the lies. Yes, I was ready. "Yes," I said. "I'm ready." We didn't file immediately. Elizabeth advised against it. Instead, she drafted a settlement proposal that we were going to present to Michael. The idea was to give him a chance to settle without going to court, which would be faster, cheaper, and would give him an opportunity to avoid the full exposure of his behavior. The proposal was straightforward. We were asking for 50% of the marital assets, including the hidden account, a portion of his retirement accounts, spousal support for 2 years while I got back on my feet professionally, and the apartment for 6 months, so I could have a stable place to live while I transitioned. It was fair. It was more than fair, given what he'd done. But I knew Michael well enough to understand that he wasn't going to accept it gracefully. He was going to fight it, challenge it, try to manipulate the situation. I had 1 week to prepare. 1 week to gather my courage, to strengthen my support system, and to make sure I had everything in place for what was coming. I told my mother everything. I told her about the emails, the affairs, the hidden money, the premeditated abuse. I told her about Elizabeth's plan. I told her I was going to need to leave suddenly, possibly that day, and that I would need to stay with her and my father. Of course, she said without hesitation. We'll prepare a room for you. Whatever you need, Margaret. We're here. I told Claire. She was shocked by the depth of what had been happening, but she also wasn't surprised. She'd been watching it happen for years. She took my hand and said, I'm so proud of you for doing this. I'm so angry at him, but I'm so proud of you. Dr. Coleman and I had one final session before everything happened. She helped me prepare for the emotional intensity of what was coming. She helped me understand that I might feel guilt, even though I shouldn't. That I might second-guess myself, even though I was making the right choice. She gave me tools for grounding myself when things felt overwhelming. You're not doing this to hurt him, she told me. You're doing this to save yourself. You're choosing yourself, and that's the most important thing you can do right now. I also quit my secrecy in a way. I went back to my gynecologist for an appointment, and I asked him to document the stress-related symptoms I'd been experiencing. Irregular periods, weight loss, insomnia, anxiety. I wanted medical documentation of the physical toll this was taking on my body. Then I arranged the confrontation. Elizabeth and I decided I would approach Michael on a Saturday morning. He was usually in a better mood on weekends, or at least less hostile. We decided I would start a conversation with him, that I would tell him I wanted to talk about our marriage, that things weren't working, and that I wanted to separate. I didn't tell him I had a lawyer. I didn't tell him I had evidence of his affairs. I didn't tell him I knew about the hidden accounts. I just told him I needed to talk. That Saturday morning came, and I was terrified. I felt like my heart was going to burst out of my chest. I was shaking so badly that I could barely hold my coffee cup steady. Michael was reading the newspaper in the living room. He was in a relatively good mood. He hadn't been aggressive or critical that morning. In a way, that made it harder. It would have been easier if he'd been awful. But instead, he seemed almost normal. Almost like the man I'd married. Michael, can we talk? I said. My voice was steadier than I felt. He lowered the newspaper and looked at me. About what? About us. About our marriage. I don't think this is working anymore. His expression shifted immediately. The casual, relaxed look was gone. He set the newspaper down slowly and turned to face me fully. What are you talking about? He said. His voice was quiet, but there was an edge to it. What do you mean it's not working? I mean that I'm not happy. That I haven't been happy for a long time. That I think we need to separate. He stood up. He wasn't aggressive physically, but there was something menacing in the way he moved. He walked toward me, and every instinct in my body told me to back away. But I forced myself to stand still. This is because you've been seeing someone, he said. It wasn't a question. It was an accusation. You're having an affair. No, I said. I'm not having an affair. I'm unhappy. I need to leave. You're not going anywhere, he said. His voice was so cold. You understand that? You have no money. You have no job. You have no place to go. You're completely dependent on me. And you're never going to be able to support yourself. So you're just going to have to accept that you're stuck with me. This was the moment where I was supposed to feel defeated. This was the moment where, 3 months ago, I would have believed him. I would have felt trapped and hopeless and like there was no way out. But I wasn't that person anymore. I do have a place to go, I said calmly. I'm staying with my parents, and I'm filing for divorce. My attorney will be in touch with you on Monday. His face went absolutely red. I watched the rage build in his eyes, and for a moment, I thought he was actually going to hit me. His hand clenched into a fist, and he raised it. But then something stopped him. Maybe it was the look in my eyes. Maybe it was the fact that I wasn't backing down. Maybe it was the realization that things were no longer going according to his plan. He lowered his hand, and when he spoke, his voice was so quiet I could barely hear it. But it was absolutely venomous. You're making a huge mistake, he said. You think you can do this without me? You think you can survive without me? You're going to regret this for the rest of your life. I'm going to take everything from you. Your reputation, your dignity, everything. No one is going to believe your lies. They're going to see you for what you are. a crazy, unstable woman who couldn't handle being married to a successful man. I didn't respond. I just turned around, walked into the bedroom, grabbed the small suitcase I'd packed and hidden, and walked out of the apartment. I got in my car. I drove to my parents' house, and I didn't look back. The filing happened on Monday. Elizabeth submitted the divorce petition along with the settlement proposal. She also submitted a protective order request based on the documentation of emotional abuse I'd provided. The week that followed was absolute chaos. Michael tried to contact me constantly. He called my parents' house. He called my cell phone. He sent emails. Some of them were apologetic, begging me to come back. Some of them were threatening, telling me I was making a terrible mistake and that I would regret it. Some of them were alternating between the two, which was even more destabilizing. My parents were amazing. They changed the locks. They screened calls. They didn't let him through. They just let me cry and sleep and slowly start to come back to myself. I didn't have a job yet, but I also didn't need one immediately. My parents let me stay with them for free, and the settlement process had started. It wasn't going to be quick, but it was happening. Michael rejected the settlement proposal immediately. His attorney came back with a counteroffer that was insulting. He was claiming that I was mentally unstable, that I was exaggerating the abuse, that I'd misunderstood his emails. He was claiming that I'd stolen from him by having the secret bank account. He was arguing that the hidden accounts were separate property, not marital property, because they'd been opened before we got married, which was a lie. But I had documentation. I had emails. I had therapist records. I had medical documentation of the physical symptoms caused by stress. I had my journal with detailed accounts of the abuse. I had testimony from my parents, my therapist, my attorney, and even Jasmine, my former colleague, who was willing to testify about the change in my behavior after I'd given up my job. The court ordered a temporary protective order. Michael was not allowed to contact me. He was not allowed to come to my parents' house. He was not allowed to approach me in any way. The violation of this order would result in criminal charges. The protective order was one of the most validating moments of my entire life. It was the legal system saying, yes, what happened to you was wrong. Yes, we believe you. Yes, we're going to protect you. But the legal battle was far from over. Michael fought every single thing. He claimed the emotional abuse was exaggerated. He said he was just being honest with me about my shortcomings, that wasn't abuse, that was just good communication. He claimed the financial control was necessary for household management. He claimed the isolation was my choice, that he'd never prevented me from seeing my friends. All of it was lies, but he presented them so smoothly, so reasonably, that I could see how someone who didn't know the full story might believe him. The depositions were grueling. I had to sit across from Michael and his attorney, and I had to recount every incident, every manipulation, every moment where I'd been made to feel crazy. They questioned me aggressively, suggesting that I was the one who'd been abusive, that I'd deliberately isolated myself, that I was making this all up because I was angry he was having affairs. But Elizabeth was fierce. She presented the evidence. She brought in Dr. Coleman to testify about the psychological impact of coercive control. She presented the bank statements showing the financial abuse. She presented the emails where Michael had explicitly discussed his plan to destroy me. And slowly, the case started to shift. The judge started to see what had really happened. By October, 5 months after I'd left, we had a settlement agreement. Michael was going to have to pay me $120,000 from his various accounts and retirement funds. He was going to have to pay me spousal support for 18 months while I got back on my feet. I was going to keep the apartment for 1 year. And he was going to have to pay for my attorney fees. It wasn't everything, but it was more than fair. More importantly, it was recognition. It was the legal system saying that what he had done was wrong. When the judge read the decision, I cried. Not tears of sadness, but tears of relief. Tears of vindication. Tears of release. Michael's face was absolutely purple with rage. He didn't speak. He just stood up and walked out of the courtroom. The months after the settlement were the strangest of my entire life. I had won. I had escaped. I had my freedom back. But I didn't actually know what to do with it. For 2.5 years, my entire existence had been organized around Michael's needs. My day, my time, my thoughts, my body, everything had been structured around making his life easier and better. And suddenly, that structure was gone. I moved back into the apartment in November. Michael had 30 days to vacate, and when he did, I felt like I could finally breathe. I took down all the pictures that were in the apartment. I rearranged the furniture. I painted the walls colors that I liked, not colors that he approved of. I filled the space with things that made me happy. One of the first things I did was call Jasmine at her new company. I asked if they were still interested in me, and they were. I started working again as a marketing coordinator in December. It was lower pay than I'd had before, but it was mine. I'd earned it, and every paycheck felt like a miracle. I spent a lot of time in therapy that first year after leaving, not just with Dr. Coleman, but also with Maria, the domestic violence counselor. We worked through the trauma of what I'd experienced. We worked on rebuilding my sense of self. We worked on understanding that what had happened was not my fault, that I had not done anything to deserve it, and that I had every right to be angry. But we also worked on moving forward, on not letting this define me, on understanding that surviving abuse doesn't make you strong. It just makes you a survivor. And being a survivor was enough. I reached out to Claire and actually cultivated our friendship again. We had coffee regularly. We went to movies. We took a weekend trip to Newport, just the two of us. She never made me feel guilty about the time I'd lost with her. She just welcomed me back into her life with open arms. My relationship with my parents completely transformed. They'd been supportive, but they'd also been distant in some ways after I'd gotten married. But after I left Michael, they were present in a way they hadn't been in years. We had dinner together every Sunday. We talked on the phone regularly. They helped me understand that they'd been worried about me for a long time, that they'd seen the changes in me, and that they'd been so relieved when I finally reached out to them. We were so angry at him. My mother told me one day while we were cooking together in her kitchen. So angry. But we were also angry at ourselves for not doing more, for not pushing harder, for respecting your boundaries when your boundaries were being violated. We've realized since then that sometimes protecting someone you love means not respecting their autonomy if that autonomy is being used against them. You couldn't have done anything, I told her. I had to come to this on my own. I had to be the one to decide to leave. I know that intellectually, she said, but emotionally, it's been hard to accept. But I also had to do the hardest work of all, forgiving myself. I had to forgive myself for not seeing what was happening sooner. I had to forgive myself for believing his lies. I had to forgive myself for making excuses for his behavior. I had to forgive myself for allowing myself to become so small, so dependent, so disconnected from who I was. This was work that took months. This was work where I'd have breakthroughs and then setbacks. There were nights where I'd wake up in the middle of the night with my heart racing, convinced that I'd made a terrible mistake, that I should go back to him, that somehow this was all my fault. But Dr. Coleman helped me understand that these were trauma responses, that my nervous system had been conditioned to see danger as normal and safety as frightening. That healing wasn't linear, that some days would be harder than others. By the spring of the following year, I'd been separated from Michael for about 6 months. I was living independently, working full-time, and slowly rebuilding my sense of self. But I was still dealing with a lot of anxiety and fear. Michael had made it clear that he wasn't going to accept the settlement peacefully. He was appealing the decision, claiming that the judge had been biased against him, that I'd manipulated the court system, that he'd been treated unfairly. It was exhausting and terrifying. But Elizabeth assured me that the appeal had no merit. The judge had been thorough and fair. The evidence was overwhelming. He was probably going to lose again, and when he did, he would have to pay my attorney fees for the appeal as well. He eventually dropped the appeal. I don't know if it was because he realized he was going to lose, or if he just got tired of fighting. But one day in May, Elizabeth called to tell me it was over. The settlement was final. Michael no longer had any legal claim on me or I on him. "You're free," Elizabeth said. And I was, legally, financially, and more slowly, psychologically. That summer, I took a solo trip to Portugal. I'd always wanted to go, But Michael had refused to travel anywhere unless it was to places he wanted to go. I spent 2 weeks there, wandering through Lisbon and the Douro Valley, and I felt something shift inside me. It was like I was slowly returning to myself. Not the self I was before I met Michael, because I could never go back to that person, but a new self, a self that had been tested and had survived, a self that understood what she was capable of enduring and what she was capable of achieving. I came back to Boston with a sense of purpose. I threw myself into my work. I got promoted to senior coordinator by the end of the year. I started taking classes at Boston University, working toward a degree I'd always wanted but had never pursued. I went on a few dates, though I was cautious. I was learning to understand what a healthy relationship looked like, and I had to unlearn so many of the patterns that had been ingrained in me. The first man I dated seriously after the divorce was named David. He was a kind man, thoughtful, and he had the most important quality that Michael had never had. He was genuinely interested in my thoughts, my feelings, my opinions. He didn't try to change me or correct me or make me feel small. He just let me be myself. But ultimately, we weren't right for each other. I realized that I wasn't ready for a serious relationship yet. I was still learning who I was, and I needed to do that on my own for a while. 2 years after I left Michael, I'd been promoted to marketing manager at my company. I'd finished my first year at Boston University, working toward a degree in nonprofit management. I'd rebuilt my friendships. I'd healed my relationships with my family. I'd bought myself a beautiful piece of jewelry, a necklace with a single diamond that I'd purchased with my own money, that I'd earned myself, that symbolized my independence. And then the divorce was finalized. 2.5 years after I first left, the papers came through. I was no longer married to Michael. I was no longer legally connected to him in any way. I went to the courthouse with Elizabeth, and when we walked out, I felt something profound shift inside me. It was like a weight I'd been carrying for so long had finally been lifted. I called my mother from the courthouse. "It's over," I said. "I'm not married to him anymore." She cried. They were happy tears. "How are you feeling?" she asked. "Free," I said. "I feel free." That evening, I went to dinner with Claire, my parents, and Dr. Coleman, who had become a real friend to me by this point, not just a therapist. We celebrated not the divorce itself, but the liberation. We celebrated my courage. We celebrated my survival. We celebrated the fact that I'd chosen myself. 1 year later, I was 39 years old, and I'd completed my degree. I was offered a position as the development director at a nonprofit that provided services to domestic violence survivors. The irony was not lost on me. I was going to spend my career helping women get out of situations like the one I'd been in. On my first day at the job, I met a woman named Tanya in the hallway. She looked terrified. She looked like I'd looked 2 years ago. And I went to her and I put my hand on her arm and I said, "Whatever you're going through, whatever has brought you here, I want you to know that it gets better. It gets so much better." She started crying, and I hugged her, and I understood in that moment that this was why I'd survived. This was why I'd been put through everything I'd been put through, so that I could reach back and help someone else survive it too. The work I've done in this field over the past several years has been the most fulfilling work of my life. I've helped dozens of women escape abusive situations. I've trained new advocates. I've given presentations at hospitals and police departments and schools about the warning signs of coercive control. I've never married again, and I'm okay with that. I'm 44 now, and I'm happy. I have a career that means something. I have friendships that are deep and real. I have a relationship with my family that's strong and loving. I have a beautiful apartment that's decorated exactly the way I like it. And I have peace. The last time I saw Michael was 3 years after our divorce was finalized. I was at a coffee shop in Back Bay, and he walked in. For a moment, I felt a flutter of that old fear. But then I looked at him, and I realized something profound. He had no power over me anymore. He was just a man who had tried to destroy me. Yes, but a man who had failed. Because I'd survived him. I'd not just survived him, I'd thrived in spite of him. He saw me, and his face went dark. He looked like he was about to come over and say something, but then he saw that I was with a colleague, and he hesitated. He turned and walked out of the coffee shop. And I just smiled, because I was no longer afraid of him. I no longer needed his approval or his love or his validation. I was complete without him. To anyone listening to this who recognizes themselves in my story, I want to say something. If you're in a relationship where someone is controlling your money, isolating you from your support system, constantly criticizing you, making you doubt your own reality, then that is abuse. That is not love. That is not marriage. That is a trap. And I want you to know that you are not crazy. You are not broken. You are not unworthy of love. You are simply in a situation that is designed to break you. And I want you to know that you can get out. It will be hard. It will be terrifying. It will require you to rebuild yourself from the ground up. But it is possible. I did it. And so can you. There are resources available to you. The National Domestic Violence Hotline is available 24 hours a day at 1-800-799-7233. There are shelters. There are lawyers who specialize in domestic abuse cases. There are therapists who understand what you're going through. There are friends and family members who will stand with you if you let them. The first step is the hardest. The first step is admitting that what's happening is not okay. The first step is saying it out loud, saying it to someone you trust. And then the next step is reaching out for help. I'm not going to pretend that leaving was easy. It wasn't. It was the hardest thing I've ever done. But it was also the best thing I've ever done. And I would do it again every single time. My life now is not a fairy tale. It's not a fantasy. It's real and complicated and sometimes difficult. But it's mine. And that makes all the difference. I am Margaret Sullivan, and this is my story. This is my truth. And I'm no longer silent.